Well, this is a kind of fun talk. It derives from a talk I gave in Tucson a long time ago. And it's obviously very speculative, but still the question is, so now I'm going to assume that life exists out there. I'm going to assume that physics is the same out there. So suppose intelligent aliens do exist. So let's forget about the problems, how they came into being. Firstly, given physics and chemistry as it is, what is likely in terms of alien physiology and intelligence? Can we say anything? And I think we can, because there are universals in biology in general and in the way the brain works. And we can ask, and we can predict the broad nature on this basis, probably. And secondly, what is likely in terms of alien society and values? Can we say anything about the probable morality of aliens should we ever meet them? And I'm obviously on extremely speculative territory here, but nevertheless I think it's fun to look at. And of course a lot of this has been explored in a lot of science fiction writing and films, and I think science fiction can be really, really interesting in terms of thinking of possibilities. So, what are the likely restrictions on intelligent alien life, given physics and chemistry as they are? Are the principles of biology the same elsewhere? And yes, because they're based on the possibility spaces for biology, which I've talked about in other parts of this series of lectures. There are only a restricted number of ways to solve the problems of life, which has universal necessities, and so there's a substantial literature on convergence in biology. For instance, Simon Conway Morris, Life's Solution, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. S. Fogel, Cat's Paws and Catapults, Mechanical Worlds of Nature and People, where he contrasts how engineers have solved problems as opposed to as to the solutions nature has found. And the book I've kept saying that I think is a really great book, Andreas Wagner, Arrival of the Fittest, Solving Evolution's Greatest Puzzles. And the first two are talking about convergence. There are others. Andreas Wagner is talking about this possibility space at the micro level, out of which all of these macro solutions are constructed. So firstly, would life on other planets have an evolutionary origin? So evolution is the way life came into existence on Earth. Would evolution, Darwinian type evolution, be the origin of life elsewhere? And yes, I think without any question this has to be the way it would be out there as well. There is no other way that the complexity of life could come into being. Life cannot self-assemble. This is fundamental. People keep on trying to see what are the limits of self-organization. And I'm making a strong claim here. There isn't any way that life can self-organize. It has to come about through Darwinian evolution, which is not a self-organization process. It's a top-down process because you're adapting to the environment. So it'll have to arise through the kind of adaptive evolutionary processes described by an extended version of the evolutionary modern synthesis. So there's a substantial literature nowadays, and some of you here will be much more expert than I am, nevertheless, saying that you have to extend the modern synthesis in the ways indicated by Pigliucci and Miller in their book, Evolution, the Extended Synthesis. So both genetic drift and adaptive selection will occur, epigenetic effects will occur, multi-level selection will take place, and horizontal gene transfer in symbiogenesis will probably occur. So I'm saying I believe that you have to say that this kind of extended version of the standard standard model must be what you need in order for genuine complexity to occur. There will be structure and function which have a dual relation, a fundamental feature of biology. Structure enables function. Function is realized in structure. Structure is selected to fulfill biological function, which is then enabled by that structure. So I'm saying, of course, here that function is a core feature of biology. It's what differs biological systems from purely physical systems. What are the functions needed and what are the structures that enable this to happen? So the underlying question is, how does complexity arise? And then what are the specific functions needed for life at each level of the hierarchy of complexity? Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about this, and I'm not going to repeat it here. Just to summarize, true complexity with the emergence of high levels of order and meaning occurs in modular hierarchical structures where each word is critically important. They have to be modular in order that you can have adaptive selection, taking a functioning module and tweaking it to give it a new function. you have to have, it has to be hierarchical, because to get complexity, you break down the major problem into smaller problems, into smaller problems and smaller problems, until eventually you've broken down the big problem into little problems which you can solve, and then you build it back up to get to solve the big problem. And they have to be structures. It's not random in any sense. Structures are highly ordered and are created in this created through biological processes to solve specific processes. Now, because this is the only viable way of building up and utilizing real complexity. You decompose the full problem into constituent parts and processes to handle the constituent parts. And this enables higher level phenomenological understanding, and we've been discussing this in other talks. You get your levels of complexity, and you get functions which work at the higher levels, and you can talk about those functions at the higher levels without having to understand or know about the lower levels. So for instance, as an ecologist, you do not need to know atomic physics. It may affect some parts of it, but a lot of ecological relations are same level relations which don't depend on the underlying levels. Each level in the hierarchy is described by a language suitable to that level, and so there are effective layers at each level of the hierarchy of structure. Now, what hierarchy may we expect? Well, there's going to be a molecular basis, almost certainly organic chemistry, as I'll talk about in a minute. And I think it would have to have a key cellular level. I don't think you can build up the higher kind of structure without the kind of thing that you've got in a cell. Partly for evolutionary reasons, you have to get life going, and to get life going you need to get a cell going. Then you can build up multicellular animals. And so basic living modules that combine together cooperatively. The macro components, you then need to put it together with macro components. And if you've got a body, there will be distinct functional systems that work together. So you need a skeleton or something, maybe an exoskeleton, but something to give it some kind of structure. Now, that's not absolutely necessary. Things like octopuses don't have skeletons. So we can be flexible about whether you need a skeleton or not, but something like a rigid structure, we can put a question mark on that. You do need a skin or something. You need a bounding surface to distinguish the inside from the outside. Then you put these together to get individuals that form a society, and this is the basic point, that success in a evolutionary context is much more likely if you have a lot of individuals that get together and work cooperatively than if you don't. And so almost certainly there would be some kind of societies. This is needed in order that you can get technology going. An individual cannot possibly get technology going. If you're going to form a civilization of some kind, then the individuals must find ways of working together in a society. And so, for instance, Fred, there have been science fiction talking about slime bowls or black clouds and so on. The black cloud of Fred Hoyle, I don't believe that could do the job. So, your hierarchical structure, chemical elements, chemical binding, building block molecules combining to form polymers, macromolecules folding, recognition and binding, this wonderful structure, which is where logic comes in, because the logic of recognition is where you get an if, then, else kind of structure coming in. Organelles, cell homeostasis, cells with growth, specialization and death, tissues, growth, maintenance, repair, limbs giving you physiological systems and organism homeostasis, individual organisms giving you entities with their physiological function, animal populations with competition in the food chain, ecosystems with species independence, the biomes, different ecosystems with energy and material interchange, and then the biosphere, global resource cycles. So I think that this kind of structure would be there, it has to be there, in order that you can get complex life going out there. What elements would be used? Now, they have to be some of the elements you find in the periodic table. Here, these are the common elements in green, the trace elements in blue, and the remaining elements in red in bodies that we note. And there have been these speculations, could you form life out of something else like silicon or germanium perhaps? I don't believe that for a minute. There is nothing else out there which seems to allow the complexity of structure that carbon allows. And so you've got your nucleic acids, your lipids, your carbohydrates, and particularly the proteins. And there isn't any indication whatever that silicon can form anything as complex as this, or that anything else can. And so I believe there isn't any question, but life out there would be carbon-based. And so you need particularly proteins, and the way that their shapes allow stuff like voltage-gated ion channels, enzymes, and so on. So the take-home message: 1, intelligent life will be based on modular hierarchical structures with a key cellular level made out of organic carbon-based molecules. I think I'm prepared to stick my head out about all of that and say it wouldn't be black clouds, it wouldn't be anything else. Okay, what are the functions required? You need homeostasis, you need reproduction, you need metabolism, energy acquisition and use. You need materials acquisition, use and disposal. You need locomotion and material handling. Well, some life doesn't need locomotion. Plants can sit here, but they can't do very much. I don't think the idea of an intelligent plant makes sense, because the plant, but we could discuss that, but it's an interesting kind of question. But I think that in order that you get intelligence, you have to be able to move around, use your hands, and get your action a lot of the way the brain works is you learn from actions. You create a lot of language and stuff by generalizing for what happens in action patterns. So I think locomotion is necessary for intelligence. And material handling, if you're going to create a civilization, civilizations are built on the way that we handle and use materials. We learn how to use soft materials, hard materials, electrically conducting materials, semiconductors and so on. And that all requires that you have got some kind of way of handling and shaping materials. You have, of course, to have sensory input and analysis, and what senses there would be is something one can discuss. And then for society, you need communication between individuals. It has to be coded in some way. In other words, you need a language of some kind. So the structure, the biological structure, must enable all of this, at the same time providing internal integrity and stability, which is the homeostasis, allowing change but not too much change in incremental steps as growth takes place. There's this delicate thing, both in evolution and in individuals. You're changing. It's the problem of building and changing things while it keeps functioning all the time. So the changes taking place mustn't disrupt what is happening, but they must still require a large change. It's a very delicate balance there. So homeostasis, to keep things going on an even keel, making all systems function reliably. So you've got to keep blood pressure, breathing rates and so on at a reliable levels, temperatures in whatever kind of system you've got. One of the questions you might ask there is, do you need constant temperature in an animal in order that it be intelligent? And it was a huge step forward in our own development when constant temperature systems developed, because it allowed the brain to operate within a fixed range of temperatures. And I think that that is actually crucial for the stability of the kind of processes which take place in the brain. 3 major components then: thermoregulation to facilitate all systems working reliably. It's costly but effective. Immune and healing systems to protect and repair, and the involuntary nervous systems to deal with the reflexes which protect you in certain ways. So you've got blood temperature, pressure, normal heart rate, transport across cell membranes at the micro level is a very important part of homeostasis. And each is governed by implicit goals embodied in the physical structure of the body: the oxidative system, autonomic system, immune system, and so on. So the body would necessarily have all of this in order that it be stable and able to function on a long-term basis. There would obviously have to be reproduction. How would the young be born? Eggs inside the adult with birth, feeding after birth. I'm not prepared to make any statement about how that should happen. There has to be reproduction, but it could happen in all sorts of kind of ways. Would they have sexual reproduction? Not obvious, but quite likely for the reasons which have been discussed. If you want to shuffle genes sufficiently often, then sexual reproduction has got a great deal to be said for it. But the details could be very varied, and I'm not going to even begin to speculate there. The issue of reproduction merges into the issue of care for the infant and the need for ongoing tutoring and education. And I would guess that for really complex individuals, it would be like with human beings, you would have to have a long period after birth before you're an adult, as opposed to some species when at birth you basically are already essentially in many ways an adult. Now you need metabolism, energy acquisition and use, material acquisition, use and disposal. So you would need food and drink in some kind or other. You'd need digestion, internal transport, waste collection, elimination. So yeah, you're going to be eliminating waste because of the second law of thermodynamics. So you'd need something like a mouth, teeth or a beak or something like that, something like a stomach. I think all of that would be necessary. Some animals can of course ingest through their skins, but I don't think in the quantities you would need for an intelligent being. Would you need breathing in lungs? Well, that is if you're an oxygen-based kind of animal. That isn't absolutely necessary. If the same microsystems are used which are heavily reliable on oxygen, then you would need something like lungs, but some of the biologists here would understand this far better than I can. There possibly are alternatives, but they've got to be efficient. If you are oxygen-based, you need a heart and blood or something like it to provide each cell. Each cell has to be maintained and kept alive. Now that's a big requirement, and so you need to feed energy and materials to each cell, and you need to take the waste products away from each cell. So you need some kind of system to do that. So something like the heart, something like blood to take material there and to take the waste materials away. So would they eat and drink? Yes. Would they excrete? Yes. Would they experience hunger and thirst? Yes, I think. How to move and how to manipulate things. As I've said, I think you would have to be able to move in order to be intelligent, because in a sense you learn to be intelligent by your interaction with the way you handle things and move around. But certainly if you're running a civilization, you've got to be able to move around. You can't do it stuck in one spot. So they'd need arms, legs, wings, fins, hooves, claws, tentacles, something. And one can be very, very flexible what you're saying here. But you would need something, if you're going to be an intelligent species, as I say, which could shape materials, shape metals, shape, say, fabrics, and so on. And so you would need something, some kind of way of doing that. So a flexible body. So I don't think a snake or a fish can do very intelligent stuff. I don't know why I said an athlete, forget that. So there's a huge amount of variety possible, but for technological society we need limbs with 2 or more controllable digits, fingers or similar, and we must be able to live out of water so as to handle metal technology. Dolphins can't manufacture. Suckers would be useful for us, so it'd be really quite nice if you had a sucker, you could pick things up. You've seen those animals which run up walls with their suckers. So suckers would really be rather nice, but we don't have them. Sensory input analysis. Would they have the same senses as we do? Well, they would need balance, something like touch and pain, in order to protect them, and they would need some kind of taste in order to be able to handle food. Would they need taste? Probably, partly because you need to be able to separate out bad food from food which isn't bad, and so probably you need some kind of taste or smell thing to do that. And so the balance you certainly need if you're going to be an animal walking around. Touch and pain, yes, in order to protect yourself from things like burns and from injuring yourself. You need an internal milieu and a boundary information, and so you need those kind of things. Now, sight, sound and smell. To be an effective animal, you need to see things at a distance in order that you can approach them if you want to, or avoid them if you don't want to. So sight, sound and smell are the 3 ones. You must have knowledge at a distance if you're going to be able to do well. You don't necessarily need all of these, but the combination is very effective, particularly because you want to be able to function at day and at night. And if you only have 2 of them, well, 3 of them is good to have, but you certainly could do with less. you could probably do with only one of them, but not as effectively as with all three. But the details obviously can differ. Sight, what colors and wavelengths, that would be very contextually dependent. Polarized light, maybe you could be useful to be much better at seeing polarized light. Sound, some animals utilize sonar, we don't utilize sonar. Maybe it would be useful for us to do that. One of the big ones is, why don't we have an internal compass? And some people think we do. Some animals do have, birds have internal compasses, some other animals. Would it be helpful for us to have that? Yeah, maybe. And one of the questions which is quite intriguing is radio. Would it be possible to build a radio out of the kind of materials out of which our brains are made? Could you construct the oscillator and the aerials and so on? And it's not obvious why you couldn't. One of the reasons why we haven't developed that, maybe it would be too confusing, because if we had the radio and everybody else had the radios, you would have the problem of tuning and selection what you were listening to, and it probably wouldn't be worth the effort. Although you would be able to communicate with people at a distance. So that's a kind of interesting thing, and I certainly wouldn't believe that you could necessarily rule out radios for animals out there on other planets, that they would be able to communicate in that kind of way. Now, if this information is going to be any use, you have to know what it means, so you need a brain to make sense of it and to make decisions as a result. So they certainly have to have a brain, receiving information, filtering it, discarding huge amounts of irrelevant information, categorizing, analyzing it, filing it in long and short-term memory. You clearly need all of that in order to be an intelligent being. You have to make decisions as to what to do and initiate action as a result. And you need to communicate between individuals. Individuals can only function in a society, so we need communication systems to convey information and coordinate activity. So language is a key facility here, but it doesn't necessarily have to be spoken. However, given that we can detect sound, speech becomes almost inevitable, but a flexible tongue is needed for this, a flexible larynx and all of that. But you don't have to speak to have language. Sign language works perfectly well. Well, it's slightly restricted, but nevertheless, sign language is possible. So it's not essential, and if you could develop writing, it would be possible to develop writing without speech. There's all sorts of possibilities there. Writing denotes a high level of order as to all the technological ways of extending our senses and communication, because it's you are doing an abstract representation of what is out there. What about the structural level? Will all our eyes have the same kind of structure? Maybe. The camera eye is more effective than the compound eye. There are, as is well known, about 4 or 5 different ways of making eyes, and you'd have to converge on one of those. Will the cell have the same structure? Unlikely. It seems very Hisston dependent on the way that we have cells with organelles, and it could easily be cells would have a different kind of structure, but multicellularity is essential. And the process of development biology will have to be in place. You'll have to have some way of guiding developmental biology, something like a gene regulation networks, in order to have an animal developing into a functioning multicellular animal. Will the brain have the same kind of structures we have? In detail, no, but in broad outline, yes. It'll be based on neurons or something similar, yes. Will it use neurotransmitters and neuromodulators? Maybe. I'll talk about this in just a minute. At the micro level, I've talked about that, I'll leave that. But this is all based at the micro level on these possible, at the micro scale, strict possibility spaces. There are strict possibilities in the genotype to phenotype written about by Andreas Wagner in his book Arrival of the Fittest. There's possibility space for what proteins are possible, for what metabolic networks are possible, for what gene regulatory networks are possible, and what signal transduction networks are possible. And so the possibilities are, they're very, very large. There's a huge number. So the specific one that is realized could be completely different from what we have, but it has to be selected from this library of possibilities. So the functional needs of individuals are going to be broadly the same in any community in the sense I've just discussed. It's something like the physiological structures of our bodies will be required to meet these needs. Now, as I've mentioned, intelligent life will require a brain to support sensory analysis, classification, storage, prediction, and action choice. And what is the brain's micro and macro structure? Well, almost certainly it would have to be based on neural networks of something. What would they be? Cells, so they would be neurons joined across connections. Now, one of the big things there is you can make electrical connections or chemical connections, and that's one of the questions which I'll come to in half a minute. So I think we could expect there to be neural networks because this is the best way to do this. I can't see anything like a digital computer naturally coming into existence. I can only see a neural network type structure coming into existence. So maybe someone would like to argue that one. Could we, instead of having something like this, having something much more like a digital computer arising biologically? And I don't believe that that would be possible, but that's just my opinion. So you need the networks with the connections and the details of the connections determining what we think and who we are. This allows conscious goals in human activity. Our actions are governed by hierarchically structured goals, which may be explicit or implicit. They may be qualitative or quantitative. And these goals are not physical quantities, but they occur at all structural levels and enable the mind to respond to the meaning of symbols. So in order for an intelligent society being, it must be symbolic. It must have symbolic understanding, both language, mathematics, and that enables us to construct all of these things. Now, would they have consciousness, emotions, and a brain structured like ours? I've talked about the brain, but would they have consciousness? And there's a huge debate out there about whether consciousness is necessary for intelligence. And there are probably people here who have strong opinions about that. I personally, for naive reasons, believe that consciousness would be necessary. Now, what I do believe is that emotions would be necessary, and I will discuss that in just a minute. There may be convergence also of the way brain works at the macro level in order to meet universal necessities. Brain plasticity, the brain must be plastic. It must adapt to what is happening. So there must be principles of adaptive selection applying in the brain as we interact with our environment. Now, we use genetic information in each individual for brain development, but it must also then adaptively select to the specific environment. And this is what Eric Kandel talks about. Genes are read in neurons according to the mental context. Because this allows the brain to optimally adapt to the local environment, both in terms of immediate reactions and in terms of altering synaptic connections. Now, the neurotransmitters which shape the way that these networks change come from the limbic system via the diffuse ascending systems, if you believe Gerald Edelman's book, Neural Darwinism. And these are the primary emotional systems which give guidance to intellect. So what I'm saying is the following. In our brains, we've got the columns in the cortex which analyze and generalize, predict what's going to happen. And so that kind of intellectual activity takes place up in the neocortex in columns. But it's exactly the same as a computer. In a computer, you've got your program working away, working out what some algorithm would says. The algorithm takes the data, works out the conclusion. But the question is, who decides what algorithm to run next? And that's what the operating system does. So as well as the level of running the programs, you need the operating system level which prioritizes which program is the one which you're going to run next. And my claim is that that's what the emotions do for us. And the way they do that is that there are these parts of the brain, these nuclei, which spread neurotransmitters diffusely through the brain and alter locally. Now, I discussed this the other evening, but you have to have something in the brain of these aliens. They can't just be there analyzing what's going on and so on. They have to get some kind of, there have to be some prioritization about what's important and what isn't important, and that's what our emotions do for us, and that's why emotions are crucially important in our brain. So the neurotransmitters spread to the entire brain, conveying noradrenaline, dopamine, and serotonin from the limbic system, which is the source of emotions. And so I believe that emotions and intellect interact with each other operationally in ourselves, and emotion shapes intellect developmentally, I think that would happen also. I think this would be a necessary way of things happening, because otherwise you've got to guide the adaptation. It's what's called the frame problem in evolutionary psychology. And so the claim is that intellect will not develop nor function without emotions. And Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, and his book, The Feeling of What Happens, are strong indications. If you take a human brain and you impair the emotional systems, then the intellect stops functioning properly. And there is good neuroscience evidence for that, which Damasio talks about in these two books. And so I can think we can safely presume that intelligent aliens will have emotions. They will not be Dr. Spock. Okay. In short, emotion underlies intellect. And so I've got this overall picture of the mind. We've got rationality working out what will happen. But in rationality, you take some data and you work out what will happen and you make a decision. But in the real world, you never have enough data to make a decision. You're deciding whether to go somewhere to take a job. You're deciding whether to get married to someone. You're deciding whether to buy some shares. There's never actually enough data. So you have to work it out as far as you can, and then eventually you have to say, I can't continue thinking about it. I've got to make a decision. And you make that decision on the basis of faith and hope, faith that it's going to work out and hope that it'll be right. The emotions are guiding this, as I've just indicated, and the emotions are shaping. Actually, emotions work much faster than rationality. When you face a situation, your emotions rush in first and tell you what to do, and then your rationality comes in later on and says, wait a minute, think about it. Is that a good idea or not a good idea? Your emotions are separated into the primary ones, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the secondary ones. The primary ones are genetically or biologically determined in order to give us guidance as to how to work, and these have been developed through evolutionary epochs to give us a set of guidances as to how to work. The secondary ones are our social ones, and they are much different from those. Those are not determined genetically. The ones on the left are determined genetically, the other ones are not. Now, the way rationality works depends on your perception of things and your attitude to risk. Some people are willing to take a lot of risk, and they will take their decision on the basis of rather little data. Some don't want to take risk, and so they wait and they collect more and more data, and they wait until they've got masses of data. Now, if you are too risk averse, the time passes and you don't take a decision until it's too late. And so your perception of the situation and your risk decide what kind of decisions you make there. While taking the decisions, intuition and imagination matter. And so intuition is not the same as instinct. Intuition is fast-wired rationality. So you've got the intuition of a heart surgeon or a fighter pilot or a ballet dancer or whatever, and this is that you've done the thing many, many times, a piano player, and then it becomes then intuitive. You have hardwired what you learnt as a result of rationality. So you walk into the doctor's room and he listens to you for 2 minutes and he sort of think, maybe you've got pneumonia, go and get an x-ray. And he does that without thinking it rationally through. He does it on a pattern recognition basis. And if you challenge him, why did you say that? He will have to rationalize and say, well, I did this for that reason, but he didn't go through all of that. He did it on his basis of his intuition. And imagination is very important, because when you're looking at rationality, you're choosing between alternatives. And some people see only very few alternatives, and some see a great variety of alternatives. And so the solutions you come out depend on that. Now, what is crucial is feeding down onto the system from the top are ethics, aesthetics, and meaning. And these shape everything else. Because when your rationality is working, let's take ethics as perhaps the most important of these, you're choosing rational choices between options. Your ethical system says some things are allowed and some are not allowed. So in the set of rationality, you will have a set of choices. Some people will say, well, I'll go and get a gun and shoot someone so that I can get the money from them. Other people will say, my ethical system doesn't allow that. And so what takes place at the rational level is governed by this higher level of meaning. Some people use the word telos, and again aesthetics. You've got a desire for beauty in some form or other. That guides your rationality. Will I buy this house or not? Yes, because it has a lot of beauty in the view from the house. So this is the kind of thing. You've got values which guide the way rationality works. So you've got emotion feeding from below and values feeding from above. And this is my sort of brief model of how the mind works. Each of emotions, rationality, faith and hope, perception, attitudes to risk, intuition, imagination, aesthetics, ethics and telos, which is meaning or purpose. These are all interacting in this complex way. And I believe that for these aliens you would find that whole structure working for them as well. Okay? Because I think that this is the way it would have to work. Now, we could discuss whether some of these could be missing. We could discuss whether there are some which could be there but aren't there. But this is the way, in my opinion, how our minds work, and that's what I'm prepared to argue for. So they're modulated by the society in which they live. They cannot be understood in isolation, and this is very, very well known. You cannot understand an individual mind on its own. Society feeds into your ethics, aesthetics and meaning, to your perceptions and risk, and into the secondary emotions. And so society is modulating this all the time in a top-down kind of way. Now, it's possible for neurons to be directly wired to each other rather than using the rather odd mechanism of sending neurotransmitters across a synaptic gap to convey information from an axon to a dendrite. Why has this strange soup-based mechanism involved instead of the simpler use of direct wiring? And there are electrical synapses where you just wire the one neuron to the other instead of using the neurotransmitter mechanism. And let me just show you. This is the mechanism we've got. The signal comes down. It's an electrical signal. It comes in pulses. It gets transformed by a whole complex mechanism into a chemical signal which goes across, and a whole complex mechanism then transforms it into another electrical signal. It's a heck of a complicated mechanism. Would you expect something like that to occur in the brains of these other beings? Why is this strange soup-based mechanism involved instead of the simpler and faster use of direct wiring? And the answer, I think, is that we would expect this kind of system because that's what's required for the plasticity that I was just talking about. The neurotransmitters from the limbic system are coming in and can get into the synaptic gap and alter this. They can change the gene regulation in this area. And so I think that this kind of mechanism would be there because this is what enables real plasticity in the brain to take place. So this mechanism is needed in order that neural Darwinism can take place. By using neurotransmitters to convey information across synapses, one enables non-local modulation of synaptic effects by neurotransmitters from what Edelman calls the value system that are conveyed to all the neurons in a cortical region rather than being transmitted to precisely chosen synaptic connections. So the electrical through to chemical through to electrical thing, I think that the reason that it's done that is because it enables a lot of modulation and learning to take place by altering those processes. Non-local influences are possible. Which are the specific primary emotions? And I talked about this the other evening. For the basic functioning, the pleasure-distress system, liking or fulfillment, which leads to learning because you learn to do things which give you pleasure, and the seeking or wanting system where you're searching for meaning, arousal, excitement and seeking, and then you satisfy your needs by looking for something and then finding it. And so the seeking system makes you look for things, and the other one turns off the seeking system by giving you pleasure and saying, now you're done, that's it. This is the kind of basic emotional system which underlies general functioning. And so this is one of the primary systems which Panksepp talks about, and I think one could expect this to be there as well. The basic survival, there's the disgust system which enables you to avoid harmful foods. There's the fight and the flight system, the rage and the fear systems. I think it's pretty likely that alien animals would have these as well, because these are very important for individual survival. And then the very interesting primary emotional system is the play system, which starts off as rough and tumble play and then develops into physical, imaginative play. And I think that you would also have the play system. So why do you play because it's enjoyable, because it's an emotional system which you like doing it. Why is that important? It's because that leads animals and humans and children to experience, to explore, to practice, and that's where problem rehearsal, creativity and aesthetics comes from. So I think that would be there as well. The social needs, reproduction, you obviously need that, whatever your system is. As I've emphasized, that for society to function, for survival to be good, you need a society. Why do individuals form a society? Now, they don't sit down and think it would be a good idea to support a society. Individuals join societies, they join groups because they want to, because there's a deep emotional need to belong to groups. This is the need or the attachment system which creates bonding through the need for others. And this starts with the mother-child bonding, but it then gets generalized that you have a need at a later stage to belong to the community, in which is a very, very deep need. Then there's a reciprocal one. These come in pairs, the care-nurturance system, which caring for others, particularly children, the mother-child bonding. We wouldn't survive if the mothers didn't bond with the children and look after them. Infanticide would be very, very common if it wasn't for these hormones that flood the mother's brain and tell them to look after this child despite all of the problems which are occurring. And then once you've got your group, you've got to regulate conflict. And what nature has developed is the rank system, the dominant submission system, which controls aggression in society. And this goes back to very ancient systems. It goes back to chickens with the pecking order. It goes to dogs with the alpha male. It goes to animals, all of the hierarchy. The way that you regulate conflict in social systems is the ranking system, where you compete for your place in the hierarchy, but once you've got your place in the hierarchy, then peace reigns for a while because you've each accepted what you are, and this is how we keep the society together, not fighting for resources, because you've got a system for handling resources, which is through the ranking system here. And this is to do with territory in the very broad sense of the word. In the academic world, people fight for their academic territory, for their ranking in academic world. So this is what underlies a lot of military stuff, a lot of political stuff, a lot of academic stuff, a lot of social stuff, is the ranking system. Okay, would they have discovered the same abstract structures as we have? Mathematics, algorithms for computers, physics theories, and language? I believe they would, because I believe, as I argued already, there's a Platonic world of mathematical reality as well as a world of particle and forces. And these other civilizations would, I believe, have discovered the same mathematical structures because they are explored, not created. They're causally affected by discovery, and they underlie engineering and physics. They can be represented in many ways, but the underlying structure is invariant and universal. So the basic geometrical figures, would they know these? Yes. The same result would be discovered over there as here. Would they have discovered the Mandelbrot set? Probably. The Julia set? Probably. Would they have discovered these kind of algorithms for sorting? Yes. If they've got computers, yes, they would have. Would they have discovered the language universals that Chomsky talks about? Yes, they would have, because Terence Deacon has plausibly argued that any language system must obey necessarily semiotic constraints on a universal grammar. There's a possibility space for languages. These two are discovered by humans rather than being created, because they are based in the underlying logic of what is possible in symbolic representation of the real world. So Terence Deacon says semiotic constraints delimit the outside limits of the spaces of possibilities in which language has evolved within our species, because they are the outside limits of any symbolic form of communication. When you've got a symbolic system, it must represent what it's trying to represent in an adequate way, and that places strong restrictions. The symbolic system must be some model of what's out there, and that's what he's talking about. There's one possible major improvement in the brain. The key bottleneck in our intelligence is the linear flow of thought at the macro level arising out of the massively parallel processes at the micro level. Think how good it would be if our intellectual capacities could be improved if we could run several parallel processes at the macro level, and so we could be thinking several different things at the same time. In that case, we would be super intelligent compared with what we are. So is there something preventing that from happening? I don't think there is in principle. So maybe there might be people out there, individuals, whatever, who could run parallel processing at the macro level, not just the micro level. So would their minds also function through a balance between intellect, faith, emotion, and values as ours do? I believe so. And this also enables a good balance between nature, nurture, and consciousness in determining what happens. They may have something like the same primary emotional systems, allowing some empathy between us, or hostility for that matter. They will have discovered the same Platonic realities such as mathematics, algorithms, and language structures. What kind of social structures? Oh, I've got to start going. I'm going to skip all of that. Would they have basic living shelters, housing, water supplies, drainage and sewing? I believe they would. Water supply systems, transport, energy supply systems, books, printing, economics, yes. If you think about all of those science fiction books and films, they assume that all of this is out there, that they would all have these kind of things. And these are to meet the universal needs of a society. Societies have universal needs just as individuals do. I could go back to that in the discussion period if we wanted to. Would they have commerce, shops, offices, advertising? Would they have money? That's a key question. I certainly believe that they would have discovered the possibility of money because it's such an important thing in the way that economies flourish. Would they have schools and universities? Yes. In order that technology can flourish, you must have specialized knowledge and you must train people in those specialized knowledge. Would they have military, police, safety, weapons, courts, prisons, fire engines, and ambulances? It's a pretty good guess that they would have all of these. I'm guessing at a certain level. On the other hand, I can point you to the functional needs, the universal needs for any society. They must have structure. The structure must be defended. There must be safety. There must be systems to ensure that all of that happens. They would have to have technology if they're going to be technological civilizations. They would have to be manufacturing. They'd have to have medicines and so on. And one of the kinds of things one can talk about, would they have limb regrowth? Now that I think would certainly be a possibility. One of the things we're just beginning to move across at the present. In principle, if you lose a limb, all of the information is there to regrow the limb in your DNA. Why can't you get the developmental system to restart and regrow that limb again? And I believe that's one of the things that they might have found possible. Computers and so on. Just a couple of comments here. Would they have time travel? No, not possible. Would they have transporters like Star Trek? No, not possible. Would they be able to download? Would they be able to download their brains to computers? No, not possible. An interesting kind of question. Would they have plays, ballet, dance, music, arts gallery, restaurants, playgrounds, and so on? I think there's a pretty good guess that they would. But what I wanted to get onto is the final one. Will we have to fear them? If we detect them, should we send out gunships or welcoming parties? Will it be E.T. or Independence Day? Maybe they'll be just indifferent to us. Maybe they will want to keep well away from us. What are their values likely to be? Okay. And I've emphasized you need values, and values cannot be obtained from science. Values are needed for making coherent choices in the applied sciences and technology. They depend on selecting a value system, which you have to choose. Values are needed for society and for personal life. Now, I'm going to put forward the idea that there's a possibility space for morality, which has really got four kinds of different possibilities. The first one is coercive morality. We'll force you by brutality. That's the oldest one, and it's still very common today. Might is right, the idea of coercion as being what morality is about. And in some sense, this is what's built into evolution. Evolution is about survival. It's about surviving, killing other people in order that you can survive. And I have a neuroscience friend who has told me face to face that the origin, that the real morality is simply survival, which is this coercive morality. The second one is the reward or consumer morality, that morality is about being able to spend, to own things. That the goal of, when I talk about morality, I'm talking about the goals of life. That the goal of life is to own a lot, to be very, very rich. And this is currently what happens at the macro scale in a lot of societies. At the micro scale, there are some neuroscience books talking about this, in which they assume that morality is about happiness. And there's a book talking about what it calls a moral molecule, which turns out to be a molecule which makes you feel happy. The assumption is that happiness is the same as morality. There's the intellectual view of morality, that you can argue about morality, work it out on an intellectual basis, and it'll then be so obvious and so clear, so logically clear, that people will have to follow that. And I don't believe that for a minute. It's the kind of the old Greek philosophy and some French intellectuals. It underlies some arguments for a functional society, that morality, that our behavior has to be the way it is in order that society can function. And so you argue on that basis morality has a certain structure because society couldn't function otherwise. But the one which I believe is the most important in the end is what I call kenotic morality, the morality of love and self-sacrifice. And this is the morality which is based on the idea of giving up your welfare on behalf of the welfare of other people. Now, this is one which is based in a lot of religions, and it's the one which is, it's a deep structure of Christianity, of many other religions, and it's partially embodied in a lot of evolutionary theory about reciprocity theory and kin selection, but that's a very, very partial reflection of that. Now, I believe that this sacrifice, giving up on behalf of others, what's called kenosis, is really important. And you can't prove in some sense that any of these is valid by science or philosophy, but I'm going to end by saying that in my view, kenosis, this giving up on behalf of others, is a key element in any advanced civilization. The mother and child, the mother is willing to give up his life on behalf of the child, and then the more difficult part is willing to let go of the child in order that they can be free. The foundation of community is that individuals give up their individual rights and welfare to some extent on behalf of the community. And Eastern and Western civilizations regard this in very different ways. It's the foundation of learning. You've got to be willing to give up what you know in order that you can develop a new theory. You have to be willing to give up and say, maybe what I know so deeply might be wrong in order that I can have a new theory. It's the foundation of true artistic endeavor. If an artist has got a vision of the thing finally and they impose that vision on it, it'll never be great art. It'll only be great art if the artist shapes it and starts shaping it, and then it starts developing its own personality. The characters have got their own way of behaving and so on, and the artist then reacts to the piece that she is developing rather than forcing her own thought upon it. And it's the basis of deep social action. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, Ruby Bridges, the Amy Beale family, giving up hate, seeing and responding to the humanity of the opponent. And it occurs in all the major religious faiths. And Martin Luther King expresses that an individual has not started living until he or she can rise above the narrow confines of his or her individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Every person must decide whether he or she will walk in the light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? Now, I believe that the most advanced members of these other civilizations will agree with that. They will understand the paradoxical nature of kenosis. It's not the same as the standard economics. If I've got something you haven't got it, this zero-sum game. They may or may not agree about an underlying spiritual reality, but I believe that the advanced spiritual beings or moral beings in those civilizations will also have discovered this deep moral nature, paradoxical nature of morality as well. So this is where you end up if you, in the end, if you don't follow that route. The question is, when they arrive, will they which of these attitudes will they be coming with? Now, the kind of position I would take is the following. As you develop technology, you develop the ability to destroy society. And we basically have now got the ability on Earth to destroy all life on Earth. That technology is used by some people who are willing to destroy a lot of life on Earth. that's what's happening on the one side. On the other side, we have ethics. We have ethics developing, and there's, as it were, a race between the development of technology and ethics. And the question is, which one wins? How long is the life on Earth going to last? Will we destroy our own life? Okay, if these intelligent beings arrive on Earth, my view is that they will have overcome this tension. They will have survived long enough to have set up a stable system on their planets which allows them to live in peace and come to us, and that will be that peaceful kind of view of things which will enable them to have come here instead of the independence way of coming as Imperial Warriors trying to destroy everything in the race. That is just a guess, but it's an interesting kind of thing to think about. So my guess on this is that there are these different kinds of ones. Would they come? Would we have to fear them, that they come here to destroy us, take over everything, steal it and push off? Or would they come here to interact with us, to find out what we think, to find out what they think and so on? My guess is that they would be the latter ones, because their own civilization wouldn't have lasted long enough to develop proper space travel if they hadn't developed that high level of ethical sensibility. So that's my guess. And that's what an alien looks like. I got this off the internet. So what you've got is this set of things taking place. There's this interaction between them, the effect of society on ourselves, the effect of biology, the effect of our internal developmental plan, and our personal choice. And they would all have exactly the same kind of issues to deal with. And so this was my kind of fun thoughts about extraterrestrials and what they might be like.